Welcome to our next lesson where we are going to introduce Swagger into the DevHabit application. We'll use the Swagger UI to turn the OpenAPI specification that we have into a convenient user interface that we can use for testing our API, but also documenting it and making it available to our clients. I won't make this intro any longer than necessary. Let's jump into the code and let me show you what we're going to build. We have to start by installing the required NuGet packages for Swagger. So let me look for the Swagger packages, and the library that I want to install is Swashbuckle ASP.NET Core. I'll go ahead and install the latest version, and now I can close this down. Let's open up the program file, and right after we map the OpenAPI endpoint, let's introduce the Swagger UI. So I will say app use Swagger UI, and I want to configure the Swagger UI options. Here I want to define the Swagger endpoint, and I'm going to point it to OpenAPI/version1 JSON, and I'll provide version 1 as the name. So with just these few lines of code, we're going to start the application, and I can navigate to localhost 5001, which is the base address of my API, and then /Swagger. And I'll be greeted with the Swagger UI, which is what you are seeing here. What we did in the previous step was let the Swagger UI middleware know that they can find an OpenAPI specification at this address, which is the OpenAPI document created by the built-in OpenAPI library. What we can do from here is observe all of the API endpoints that we have defined inside of our REST API. You can see that all of the endpoints are grouped based on the controller they belong to, and they're also separated based on the HTTP method and the route. Below the endpoint definitions, you can find the schema definitions, and these represent our request and response objects. For example, I can open the create tagged ETO and observe what is the documentation for this type and which types are used in the specific properties. The stars here denote that something is required, otherwise it's nullable. So you can see we have quite a bit of DTOs that we are exposing on our API. Now let me look at one of our auth endpoints. Let's say the auth login endpoint. If I wanted to, I can send a request to this endpoint by specifying the request body. So let me provide the username and password that I can use to authenticate. I can also define which media type I want to use in the request. Let's say application JSON. Now if I try and send this request, you'll see that we are running into a problem because it's trying to send it to an unknown host and it's using the port 8081. And this is actually the internal port inside of the Docker container where my application is running, and this is also the address that's referenced inside of the OpenAPI document. So currently, we can't really test our behavior from the Swagger UI. We can just observe the endpoints that we have defined and the specifications for our request and response schemas. You will also find that the built-in OpenAPI library has quite a bit of limitations when it comes to documenting our API, which is why I want to replace it with the Swagger generator for the OpenAPI specification. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to comment out the call to map OpenAPI, and I will say app use Swagger, and this will add the Swagger generator middleware, and I'm just going to configure the default Swagger UI middleware. Then we'll need to customize our services. So I will go into add API services, and I'm going to comment out the call to add OpenAPI. Below it, I'm going to say builder services add Swagger Gen. Now, because we have API versioning configured, we have to do an additional step. I'm going to access the Swagger Gen options, and I want to call resolve conflicting actions. And here we're going to get a collection of API descriptions, and we have to figure out which one to select when we have multiple descriptions for a single endpoint. And I'm just going to say that we want to use the first available description for a given endpoint, and now we should be able to start the application. And if I navigate to the Swagger UI address, you should be able to see the same address as before. However, things are slightly different now. First, there's a different URI here pointing to the OpenAPI document. Now it says HTTPS localhost 5001. So notice that it's using the root address of our application. And then we have Swagger v1 Swagger JSON. Let's open this document and see what we have inside. And lo and behold, it's an OpenAPI specification. But this time it's generated by the Swagger library and not the Microsoft OpenAPI library. I promise that you'll quickly be able to see the advantages of using Swagger as opposed to the built-in tooling. But more on that in the upcoming lessons. If we take a look at this document, we will see a pretty similar schema to what we had before. So I'm not going to spend any time here. Let me close this down. But what you can notice is that we should be able to send a request to our API and hopefully be able to see a response back. Before we send this request, make sure that it's serialized as application.json, but also set the accepted media type to be application.json. And now if I send this request, we should get a response back that contains our access token and the refresh token. So now we can also use the Swagger UI to test our application. Now the next question is, how are we going to use this to introduce a rich API documentation? And this is the topic of our next lesson, where I'm going to show you how we can document our API endpoints to describe the responses that they return to our API clients, and also how we can easily introduce XML comments on our API endpoints and our DTOs and turn those into rich documentation for our REST APIs. In the previous lesson, I showed you how to configure Swagger, or the two components of Swagger, the Swagger generator, which creates the OpenAPI specification for your API, and the Swagger UI, which consumes the OpenAPI specification to render a user interface. Now, in this lesson, we're going to focus on adding rich documentation for our REST API by introducing a couple of additional things to our controllers. Let's start from the user's controller, for example, and see how we can introduce support for rich documentation. Now, we are already doing something right inside of our endpoints, and that is using the action result as the return type of this endpoint. The Microsoft OpenAPI tooling and the Swagger tooling picks up on this, and they can use it to translate this into a rich response. For example, they can figure out that you're returning an unauthorized status code, a not found status code, or an OK status code from this endpoint, because we're using a strongly typed action result that also defines the DTO that we are returning. Now, if we want to improve this, there is an attribute that you can use called produces response type. And for example, we can use it to configure what is the response type that we are returning, let's say the user DTO, and we can also define what is the status code that we are going to return with this response type. So this is explicitly documenting that we are returning this status code. Now let me comment this out for a moment and let's start the application. I want to take a look at this API endpoint before we make any changes so that we have what to compare it to when we do add support for better documentation. So if I go into the Swagger UI and navigate to the users group, the endpoint that we are looking for is this one, get users and with the identifier in the route. You can see that the ID value is a required value and it's a route parameter, and the only thing that's documented right now is the 200 OK response. Here you can see what is the representation of the user DTO, which is what we are returning from this endpoint. Now let's go back into our code, and I'm going to uncomment this piece of code and return back the produces response type, but let's add a few more. So we can also produce a specific status code, for example, the 404 not found, and let's also document that we can return the 401 unauthorized, and because we are defining a specific role that can access this endpoint, it would be appropriate to also return a 403 forbidden. So let me define this, and if I start the application again and I navigate to the same endpoint, you can see our 200 OK response, the same as we had before, but now there is also 401 unauthorized, 403 forbidden, and 404 not found. And by default, they are returning the problem details response type, which also matches our API behavior. So just adding a couple of these attributes to your API endpoints significantly improves the documentation of your APIs. But we can do better. We can define produces response type on the controller level. So for example, let me add those here, and now all of the endpoints inside of my controller can produce a 401 unauthorized or a 403 forbidden. Let me add the respective attributes to all of the endpoints in this controller. So I've added the attributes, and for the update profile endpoint, I introduced the 204 no content status code, which is the one that we return if this completes successfully. The 401 unauthorized and 403 forbidden are taken care of on the controller level. I also added 400 bad requests in case we run into a validation error, and 404 not found if the user isn't found inside of our system. Now, what is something else we can do? We can introduce XML documentation to our controller endpoints. By typing 3 slashes in a row, you're going to generate a summary, and here you can define the documentation for this specific endpoint. For example, I can define the summary, I can describe the DTO object, the validator object, and what this endpoint returns. So let me add these comments to all of the endpoints in this controller, and we're going to get something like this, which contains a description of the API endpoint, what the route parameters represent, and what we are returning from the respective endpoints. So I added that to all 3 endpoints, but how do you make this available inside of the Swagger documentation? We have to do a few things. In the project file of the DevHabit REST API, I'm going to add 2 more properties at the start of the file. The first one is generate documentation file. This is going to create a file that contains the XML documentation for the types in this project. The second one is turning the code analyzer that is going to complain that I have missing documentation for a public type. But the key component is this, generating the documentation file, which is going to make this available inside of an XML file that we can share with Swagger. The next thing we have to do is to tell Swagger how to find the XML file that contains the endpoint documentation. So inside of the dependency injection class, where I'm configuring the Swagger gen options, I'm going to add a few lines of code. I'm going to use a bit of reflection to get the currently executing assembly name and append XML. This will be the default name of the documentation file that we want to use, and then we want to generate the path to this file and include the XML comments in our Swagger gen options by specifying the respective path. So with just these few lines of code added, let's go ahead and start the application. I'm going to open up the Swagger UI and navigate to the user section, and this time you will see that my API endpoints contain a description representing what this endpoint does. If I open up a specific endpoint, let's say the first one, the parameters that I have will also be documented. For example, in the put endpoint, you can see that we have a bit of documentation about the request object. You can also notice that the media types that we have here are precisely the values that we have used when decorating the user's controller. So now what we can do is introduce the documentation for all of our remaining controllers, but I want to show you one more thing. The request object that we are sending in this put request to update the user's profile is the update user profile DTO. Let me see if I can find it. Here it is at the end. Now it only contains one property, but this is also something that we can document. Currently, this is just a record, and if I introduce the XML documentation, it could say something like this. Now if I go ahead and start the application and I navigate to the update user profile DTO, you can see that it now has a description which gives us more details about this type and what it represents, and also the name property is documented and it can contain some additional information that should help the API client figure out how to use it. Now let's say we take this further. What if I added documentation for all of my DTOs and all of my API endpoints? We can end up with something like this, where we have proper documentation for all of our API endpoints. If you open up a specific endpoint, let's say the endpoint for creating a batch of entries, then you can see a description of the request body and also the status codes that we can expect to receive from this endpoint. Now, another remark I want to make is that if you open up the OpenAPI specification, you can see that the summary and the request body description are now also part of the specification. Now, this is something that Swagger can do very well, and it has done so for many years, but at the time of recording this video, the Microsoft OpenAPI package doesn't support this, which is another reason why I decided to demonstrate using Swagger for documenting your REST APIs as part of this course. And if you recall our lesson where we introduced API versioning, we added multiple versions for the endpoint that allows us to retrieve a habit. But if you open up the documentation, there is just one endpoint which accepts the habit ID, the fields that we can use for data shaping. Also notice that all of these are in uppercase, and this is the case for the query parameters where we are using an object type. This is something that we are going to fix in just a moment, but what I want to highlight here is that we don't have a way to figure out which API version we want to use. Of course, we could specify application version 1 or version 2 here, but it's not obvious from the documentation that there are multiple API versions. Also, if I try to send a request to get back a habit with a specific identifier, I'll get back a 401 unauthorized response. This is because I didn't provide an access token when sending this request. So authentication is another thing that's missing. Let's see how we can fix these problems. And we're going to start by implementing support for documenting multiple API versions inside of our REST API. So let's jump into our next lesson.